came up the street, just down below Bennett's, where Bennett's live now. There was a little house there with a little old lady in there. And I always loved old people. And we kids used to go in there and sew carpet rags and things, you know, for rugs. So I come in there, and Johnny Carson, he lived just 2 doors from here. He was in the kitchen, taking the rust off an old iron bed. About that time, John said, "What would you do, Agnes, if the dam broke?" "Run home, I guess." Wasn't 5 minutes when the whistle blew and the dam broke. Now watch Dr. Mansley come out of the hospital, and he had his horse tied to the hitching post, and he was pulling the hair out of his head because he knew he lost his wife and baby. And he did. And I watched all the debris go down. And all this wood was between the paper mill and the dam. It was coming down, and it was forming clouds, just like white clouds that we have in the sky. And what a roar. It made an awful racket, scared you. Imagine Elson. She jumped between two mattresses. And she floated down over towards the bridge, towards Perry's. And the Bill Gilroy found her in between these 2 mattresses, and she was not hurt. But the mother was drowned, and the father, and the horses. He was quite a man, a very fine man. The next morning, my father went down and found a body back of our chicken coop without any clothes on. And that night, I went down in the yard to look around, and down on the avenue, these houses were forced together. And one house looked just like the saw had taken the whole front off. And I looked up in the bedroom, and there was Mrs. Libby. She was an old lady. She was standing in the corner. And she was shell-shocked. I mean, in the shock, she didn't know. So I ran up and I told my father, I said, "Dad," I said, "you better go up." I said, "Mrs. Libby's up there standing in the bedroom." So he went out and got somebody else to help him, and they brought her down. They had that fence there for the cows, and they had the barbed wire fence, and that's what caused the death of them. They couldn't cope with that barbed wire, and they got caught in it, see? Henry Lish, he managed to get under it because he was just a kid. He crawled under or jumped over it, and a couple days later he had 2 spots of gray hair like that. He was a blonde. I went to school with him. I stood up on top of the hill, watched it all going down, crying like a kid. Well, I was a kid. But I'm a very tender person, and it bothered me. I'd seen all these things floating down, all these big horses floating down, and they didn't know what in the world to do with the horses, how to dispose of them. They had to keep making bonfires so to burn the flesh up. And oh, what an odor it was. It was terrible, awful.
It was a home. It was a good thing that it was on Saturday. If it had been on a weekday, probably there had been a lot more lives lost, because our schoolhouse was right below the bridge where the dam, and one hill was dam on one side and the road on the other side. Well, they never gotten the children all out.
My dad came running down, that's right, and told my mother to come follow me right away. When my mother wanted to stop and get her purse, she said no. And so my dad picked up my brother in one arm and me in another arm and told my mother to follow. We crossed the street, went up the hill, and when we got to the top of the hill, all we could see was that our house had gone, the church had gone, except that the steeple of the church was swirling around in the water. When my father went down with these men, he found a woman who was buried in the pulpwood, and her head was separated from her, and it was such a horrible thing that the other men couldn't look, and my father had to go to try to help her, but it was too late. It was Dr. Mansley's wife. This is the actual dress that I wore that day. Much to my mother's horror, these are the shoes I wore because it was on a Saturday and I was allowed to dress myself. And I picked out the two possibly worst things I had because they were comfortable to get into. And for some reason, people persuaded my mother to save these things for me. I never knew why. Maybe this was the reason, I don't know. It's been 86 years since this happened. All of our friends and family, relatives were concerned that as a small child, seeing all these tragedies, broken bodies and mangled bodies and so on, that would have a terrible effect on my life and my outlook on life, but it didn't because my father sat down and talked with me and told me that tragedy was a part of life. We couldn't ignore it, we couldn't avoid it, but we couldn't let it affect our whole lives. We had to go on. My parents never took me back, and I never wanted to go back. I think I do now, though.
A fella come down pedaling on a bicycle like hell. He was pedaling from Austin 3 miles on a bicycle, coming right down through Costello. He went through and I was out on the road, of course, you know, at home there. And he kept shouting, the dam busted, the dam busted. Mother was baking, and Dad wasn't home because he was up to Austin with the team. And Ed, I guess, pedaling maybe. And I went in the house and I said to Mother, I said, some man went down through town here and hollering, the dam busted. I said, he was swearing. Damn, you know, I thought that was a swear word. Well, she said, the dam is busted. She says it's a lot of water. She says you get across the railroad track. The B&S train depot is right close to our property. Says you get across there and stay over there. God, she was level-headed. You couldn't scare her if you threw a bomb at her. She was really royal, I thought. She knew how to take care of things, and she never roused any fear. Mother and Dad never roused any fear in us kids to have a fear of. Just made you accept whatever happened had to be. And do what you're supposed to do. I watched everything to come down that river, or down the water rather, the flood water. I stood there where I could watch it, because I was looking for Dad and his horse. And I didn't see him go by, so I thought, well, Dad must be someplace. We didn't even know, see, if he's coming from Austin, he got caught. So I was quite happy that I didn't see our horse, nor Dad, or his wagon. He was safe. Dad used his head. He was level-headed anyway. So he came home, and I was out in the back there by the depot. I watched Dad go off at the foundation. I watched the trestle that was so tall and heavy, just flopped over and lay down, and I was hoping it didn't hit Youngs's house, the height of it. I thought, my God, if it hits her house, they won't have no house. But it slid down in the bank, see? I'll tell you what bothers me. I found a baby skeleton in one of the ditches, clear down below the Catholic church, in a side stream. I could never forget that. It was a baby skeleton. Could that baby have been washed down? Well, he was probably just out playing, and what could a mother do if the water come down? If it would gush down and they lived in the wrong place, it would take the little kid right on down. But I remember that. Oh, I'll tell you what, kids don't find ain't worth it.
Well, I can recall we were quite shocked to see the town go on when we used to go there shopping. It was a shock, even to an 8-year-old. I had in mind that someday I'd write a story about it, because I thought I was going to write stories when I was quite young.
broken remains of the Austin Dam still stand, a grim lesson about casting aside common sense, about pitting the power of nature against the power of human ingenuity, about having blind faith in the decision makers of government and industry. To some people, the weathered remains are like a forgotten cemetery, a haunting reminder of the real-life desperation of working folk, of everyday people who have to risk and sometimes lose their lives trying to keep a job. To others, the remains are monuments, memorials to remember that when tragedy strikes common people, they often show uncommon human virtue. This is a story about the struggles and the remarkable strengths of the people of Austin, Pennsylvania. Austin is located high in the Appalachian Mountains of Potter County near Big Lookout. It's a place of rare beauty from which water flows in 3 directions: north to Lake Ontario, southeast to the Chesapeake Bay, and southwest to the Gulf of Mexico. It's a place with an unusual holiness of its own. Locals call it God's country. Before the European settlers arrived, Big Lookout was a natural paradise, a virgin forest of heaven-bound hemlocks and majestic white pines, alive with fish and wildlife. According to native legends, it was home for the Black Panther, a mysterious and ever-elusive creature. Natives believed that if the panther was killed during daylight, he'd return with the coming of the full moon. And as the moon shone upon him, his hide would glow like foxfire, and his eyes would burn with a greenish light, and his dark screams would sound like a beckoning of death. During the early 1800s, pioneers came to Big Lookout to clear a few acres and eke out an existence in the uncertain serenity of the wilderness. They were a leathery, self-reliant people, always ready to chance danger for the hope of a better life. One of the early pioneers, Edward Aramel Austin, settled along a small stream named Freeman Run. For the Austin family, the solitude of their surroundings was blessed compensation for the hardships they had to endure. It had its own heavenly perfection. Downstream a piece, the Count Brownlee and the Lorenzo Dow Ripple families settled. Upstream, around the bend, the Turners. For the early settlers, Freeman Run was a fisherman's paradise, fed by pure mountain springs that bubbled from the earth. With plain words, Austin wrote in his diary,
"For me and my family, Freeman Run is always a ready source of rations, the brookies. They're just the right size for eating, and the only limit on how many I take home is how many I decide to keep."
During the 1870s, the paradise lured Grover Cleveland, the big burly mayor of Buffalo, and later the 27th President of the United States. Cleveland enjoyed leaving the complexity of city life to fish the trout holes along Freeman Run. In the simple pleasure of fishing, all he needed was a hook and a small trout to pull it. But within a few years, Freeman Valley became a paradise lost. In 1881, 3 miles downstream from Austin, the Costello brothers built a tannery, and its smokestacks became the new symbols of progress. The tanning process required vats of tanning liquor. To create it, the Costellos needed thousands of cords of hemlock bark. To get the bark, they hired men called hicks, woodsmen who would cut and strip the bountiful hemlocks of Big Lookout. With the arrival of the hicks, the once peaceful paradise echoed with the noises of change, the rhythmic ripping of the cross-cut saw, the ring of the reverberating axe, and the crashing sound of the falling hemlock. The bark peelers stripped the stumps, then the fallen trees. The fitter and the sputter worked together at a steady pace. The fitter chopped rings in the bark, then slit the bark with his axe. The sputter peeled the bark, piece after piece after piece. Watching the bark peeler was like watching the art of efficiency. Each tool, each move had its own unique purpose. The peeler's workmanship was a just-do-it exercise, an expression of his natural strength. His arm muscles developed from the motions of his labor. The work was always risky. Tragedy could strike at the blink of an eye. And after being stripped, the bare logs were slippery and sometimes slid dangerously down the steep hills. After the peeling, the bark was usually piled fleshy side down to dry, carefully stacked on horse-drawn wagons, and then hauled to the tannery.
For the outside world, the smell of Costello's leather had a natural aroma. Most people didn't think of leather as the hide of an animal, hides cleaned, then treated with liquor made from the hides of trees. But inside Freeman Valley, the once fresh air of a green hemlock forest began to reek from putrid odors that spewed from the tannery, and fish in the once lively waters of Freeman Run died from toxic acids that drained from the tannery vats.
Besides the hemlock, there were vast tracts of pine, oak, cherry, and other timbers that covered the mountains. By 1886, interest shifted from bark to lumber. Sensing the radical changes that the lumber boom would bring to their environment, Austin and other pioneers soon sold their wilderness acres to Frank H. Goodyear, a man who began as a penniless schoolteacher, but with burning ambition had become a self-made lumber baron. Goodyear promised good years ahead, a fresh prosperity for Potter County, and he quickly built tram roads and tracks on hogback trails in order to link the lumber camps to Austin's mills. The growing influx of Hicks to the area created a very colorful culture, a melting pot of diverse people and lifestyles. In fact, by the late 1800s, 9 different languages were spoken in Austin. The Hicks cut through the big sticks like a plague of locusts, going from valley to valley, mountain to mountain, chopping and clearing relentlessly. Often they lived in makeshift camps where dirt and lias were part of daily life, but they rarely complained. Instead, they accepted life's fate and jokingly referred to the lias as pants rabbits, quipping that the lias were their closest friends. For the Hicks, life in the woods was never easy. Winter work was often harsh, while summer work was hot and sweaty. Hours were long from dawn to dusk. For breakfast, it was usually bacon and eggs, or to put it in Hick lingo, sow bosom and cackleberries. Coffee was served with lots of sugar, but never cream. After breakfast, a Hick enjoyed puffing on a pipe or maybe chewing some Copenhagen snuff. A true Hick never smoked cigarettes. He called them pimp sticks. Uppity people smoked them. The work pace was steady, and talk was considered cheap. Virtue rested in what you did, not in what you said you did or what you said you intended to do. Action was the word of the woods. Action always spoke louder than words. The Hicks were hard scrabble people. They said what they meant and meant what they said. Working hours were set by the owner. Vacation time was when the boss shut down operations, and the minimum wage was whatever you got. Gold coin was always better than paper money. At day's end, a Hick was ready for supper. During mealtime, he ate fast and seldom spoke. Beef stew was the staple. Fresh vegetables rarely served. In the evening, the Hicks often played a game of penny ante or maybe a rump swatting game called hot ass. Or they listened to an accordion or the fiddling of a tune before dousing the night's glimmer. In doing his job, a Hick accepted risk as it came. The Skybird Hick, as he was called, never hesitated to enjoy a work thrill. A true man was always a risk-taker. At the pond, the unloading of the logs was done with little fuss. The pondsman, a man of perfect and certain balance, walked and checked the rolling logs. With a dry note of respect, Hicks often chuckled that the pondsman did his job as easily as falling off a log. From the pond, log after log was sent on a jack slip into the mill. Mr. Harris, the head sawyer of the hardwood mill, could neither read nor write. Yet among the mill hands, he was second to no one because of his special talent in running the big saw. Inside a powerful, jagged saw thrummed as it slashed a seemingly endless number of logs. The men of the mill moved in a smooth unison with the machinery, at times seeming to be only parts of a great monster with a mechanical heart. Typically, the men of the mill worked 11 hours a day, 6 days a week. There were no paid holidays, and vacations were few. At their peak, the Austin mills produced over 100 million board feet of lumber a year. Usually the work went smoothly, but if a hick was cheated in his pay, he could retaliate by burying a spike in a log. Needless to say, when the spike hit the saw, the mill shut down. Stripping Big Lookout created thousands of jobs and millions of dollars in wealth. But the ravaged mountains of dried brush became tinderboxes for raging forest fires, some of which were deliberately set by the Hicks themselves when they were not paid as promised. In their uncomplicated morality, Hicks believed that in order to have justice prevail, it was sometimes necessary to set loose the so-called red horse in the slashings. The environment of Big Lookout gradually became a paradise for poisonous rattlers and vermin. Like nearly all boom towns, Austin attracted too many men and too few women, and as a result, it took on a very raw atmosphere, a place said to be guided more by the temptations of the devil than the will of God.
On Saturday nights, rough-minded Hicks would flock to Austin to burn out the grease in bucket of blood joints called pig's ears. Inside, they could find fancy girls of easy virtue, gamble, and slug down as much demon rum and rot-gut whiskey as they could pay for. We had a say in it. Whiskey and women were the best medicine for life's troubles. Inside a pig's ear was like being in a cage full of wild roosters. Cockfighting was common, with lots of bragging and betting. And there were lots of men fighting, too. Fact is, at times it got real nasty, and every now and then a hick would get an ear ripped off.
On the 4th of July of 1888, the violence peaked amid an uncontrolled rampage, during which a ruffian named Kennedy shot and killed one man, wounded another, and then escaped, never to be found. Alarmed by the upsurge of lawlessness, God-fearing townspeople turned to the tents of the Pentecostal preachers.
Remember the flood of 40 days and 40 nights. Remember the anger of the Almighty with the sins of excess, with wickedness, the fire, the brimstone that totally destroyed, devastated Sodom and Gomorrah. Repent! Repent! Repent!
For the true believers, the first stroke of God's wrath was visited upon them on May 31st, 1889. On the same day as the Johnstown flood, Austin too suffered a punishing flood. In the aftermath, the people rebuilt and the community sprung back. But then, the very next year, Austin was struck by a disastrous fire.
At dawn, we were proud of our prosperity, but by dusk, most of Austin was gone.
Rising from the ashes, the people once again brought their town back to life, hoping for better times, looking for a bit of peace and harmony, just a little bit of perfection, as they gathered at Moore's Market, Ed Ballew's dry goods store, Heinball's ice cream parlor, Buckley's pool room, Perd Gallup's livery, Lee Fong's Chinese laundry, Gilroy's grocery, Impress barber shop, St. Elmo's place, and the many other small businesses in Austin. But the disasters continued. On October 15, 1891, the worst forest fires in Potter County history blackened the skies around Austin. And on May 29, 1894, another furious flood washed through the town. And then, in the fall of 1897, for the second time in a decade, the town of 2,000 people was again destroyed by fire.
The roads were dry and dusty, The water scarce that October day when Isaac Mitchell, a farmer from Inez, brought a wagon load of hay to town for Willie Nelson's horses. Willie was a grocer in Austin, known for his love of horses and his honest, straightforward way of doing things. Everything was going good till Isaac backed his wagon into Willie's stable. Didn't see an open gas jet lamp and smashed into it. The hay caught fire. There was a gust of wind, and within an hour, Austin turned into a hell on earth. Before it was over, the Presbyterian and Methodist churches were burned to the ground, and the Opera House turned to ashes. 75 families lost their homes.
Over the next 2 years, the people of Austin continued their struggle to survive. Led by Senator Frank Baldwin, they seemed to be driven more by the dream of their future than the pain of their past. Baldwin, who was the Austin Bank president, was determined to help his town by finding a new industry to replace the rapidly dwindling lumber industry. In 1900, George C. Bayless, the former mayor of Binghamton, New York, offered a new salvation. His good news was that he had chosen Austin as the site to build a paper mill, a mill that would use the very latest advances of modern science and technology. The trees of Big Lookout once more became the hope of Austin. The virgin timbers were gone, but now the scrubby second-growth pulp trees offered a new opportunity. As planned, each day the mill would produce tons of paper from tons of pulpwood.
Around this time, the Bayless Corporation was supported by the local Austin Republicans, but Democrats weren't so sure. They wanted jobs and a chance for work, but they were leery about big outside corporations built on the backs of cheap labor. One of the popular leaders of the Democrats was Willie Nelson. In 1899, Nelson won the race for Register and Recorder of Potter County. And when he did, nearby Democrat-run newspapers crowed about his upset victory. For them, Nelson was expected to be a watchdog, a man who would keep an eye on the dollar-driven, money-grubbing fat cats.
When Bayless opened his mill, he hired about 200 workers, and he had great expectations for expansion. But almost immediately, trouble tagged along. First, the 3 Potter County commissioners were indicted for being unduly influenced to lower tax assessments on the Bayless Company. Shortly after, the company was charged with polluting Freeman Run. And then yet another problem. The company discovered that the Freeman watershed was like a broken dam. For thousands of years, roots of the giant timbers soaked up and held the rainwaters, sheltered the moist soil from evaporation, and kept the water table even. But with the timbers stripped from the mountains, the spring rains raced off the eroded hillsides, and by late summer, the once steady-flowing Freeman Run looked more like an old dry brook. To assure having a steady water supply, Bayless immediately built a small earthen dam. But as business boomed, there was a growing demand for the Bayless paper, and the company had to increase its production, which often caused a water shortage. Thus, Bayless decided to build a much bigger dam, a concrete dam. T. Chalkley Hatton of Wilmington, Delaware, designed the new dam and served as the consulting engineer during construction. The dam was to stretch 544 feet across the valley, stand 49 feet high, and hold 275 million gallons of water. Throughout construction, Bayless and Hatton were at odds. Hatton wanted the foundation to be dug 9 feet deep into the bedrock, but it was only dug 4 feet. Hatton's design included a gatehouse, but Bayless eliminated it to cut expenses. Hatton wanted a valve put on the drain pipe, but a wooden cap was used instead. Hatton wanted the water level to be at 40 feet. Bayless raised it to 42 feet. And yet, even though Hatton objected to the changes, in each case he deferred to the final judgment of Bayless, the man who paid the bills, the man who paid his salary. Construction of the dam took place throughout the summer and fall of 1909, and as scheduled, it was completed by Thanksgiving. Yet even before it was filled, cracks appeared and people worried about its safety. Some thought the cracks developed because of the hurried pace of construction. They didn't think enough time was allowed for the cement to dry as each successive section was set. Others believed that the materials used to build the dam were of poor quality and that the reinforcement rods were not big enough and that the design itself was flawed. A few people feared that the cracks were the result of careless work done by some disgruntled immigrant workers. Nonetheless, after examining the cracks, Hatton concluded that they did not pose any danger and the public concern was soon quieted amid an expectation of more job opportunities. The go-ahead was given and the dam was filled.
Although we were a little worried, most of us looked at the dam as something we were rather proud of. It showed people Austin was on the road to recovery. It was bouncing back, despite a drug epidemic, the closing down of the Goodyear lumber mill, a bitter strike by the workers at the dam who demanded $1.75 instead of $1.50 a day, and despite another terrible fire. In July of 1909, Main Street was wiped out, and since there were so many fires in Austin, insurance coverage was minimal. For Willie Nelson, it was the third time he had to rebuild his store because of fires.
On January 21, 1910, an unexpected thaw, rains and melting snow filled the dam to overflowing. Water seeped and dribbled through the cracks and bubbled up from the ground just below the base. A large slice of the bank on the eastern edge slid downward about 8 feet. Alarmed by what he saw, Bayless employee Joe McKinney raced home and hurried his wife Olive and their 6 children to higher grounds. Then McKinney ran through Austin to warn others. From the hillside, the people looked down at the dam in disbelief. With the naked eye, they could see a bow in the dam, and it became obvious that a bottom section had slid forward about 18 inches. Relieving pressure on the dam became complicated because the rushing overflow made it impossible to open the valveless drain pipe. Immediately, a dynamite charge was used to blast a hole near the west bank. Then another charge was lowered onto the drain pipe to blow off the wooden cap. 16 hours later, the dam was empty. Later, Olive McKinney recalled.
At first, we were scared, but after they emptied the dam, we all went back home, chased chickens out of the kitchen, washed the dishes, and took up life where we left it. We just wanted a chance to work and live in peace. We were afraid Bayless might shut down or move the mill.
Over the next year, engineers expressed concern about refilling the dam. On March 17, 1910, a report in the prestigious publication The Engineering News predicted that the dam would break if immediate steps were not taken to correct its condition. The article concluded that water was leaking under the dam and that it was sliding toward an unsafe limit. To stop the leakage, Hatton recommended that it be reinforced with a rock fill against the downstream face, and that a cutoff wall that reached the bedrock be built across the upstream face. Despite the warnings of professional engineers, Bayless decided that the proposed changes were too expensive, and he chose to ignore them. He told Hatton that the dam needed to be safe, but not twice as safe as necessary. During the late spring of 1911, the holes were plugged and the dam was once again filled. Apparently, Bayless believed that if the concrete dam broke, it would break slowly and in parts, and even if it did break, a newly reinforced log dam upstream would hold back much of the water. He also indicated that he wanted to recoup some of the initial costs of building the dam before he did any costly repairs.
Willie Nelson. About this time, people started calling him the Jeremiah of Austin, a prophet of disaster. He was always telling people that the dam wasn't safe. I remember one afternoon a big crowd gathered when Willie and Mr. Hamlin, the boss of the mill, started a-chewing at each other. Hamlin fumed. pointed his finger at Willie, told him that he ought to mind his own business, that he was a grocer, not an engineer, said Willie was an alarmist, was getting people all worked up when there really wasn't anything to worry about, said that even if the dam did break, the water would spread out by the time it reached Austin.
During the last week of May of 1911, a woman who lived in a house on the East Hill overlooking the dam stirred up a lot of talk around Austin. Her name was Cora Brooks.
Cora operated a sporting resort for young males, and as far as some people were concerned, she was doing good by taking care of basic instincts. They figured if the young immigrant bucks went to Cora's place, they'd be less likely to bother the local girls. But not everybody in Austin agreed. Fact is, many God-fearing people thought otherwise. For them, Cora's place was a den of evil, and they wanted to drive Cora and her women of the night out of Austin. Things really heated up when Cora's place became the scene of a grisly murder involving Maud Cole, one of Cora's fancy women. The victim, John Ripple, cut timbers to build scaffolding for the dam. He was the son of L.D. Ripple, a pillar of the community. The murderer was J.D. Robinson, a dope fiend and vagabond sign painter. Robinson's crumpled-up card seemed to sum up his life. From every old place, found any old place. Given the circumstances of the case, the jury decided to spare Robinson of the gallows, and he was sent to prison. While there, he soon overcame his addiction, and he sent letters to local newspapers warning the people of Potter County about the evil of dope. Meanwhile, Maud Cole left Austin for Port Allegheny. Shortly after, she became the central figure in yet another violent dispute.
Listen, there was a bad house up there, a pleasure place. Dad would just go down to the foot of this. When we pedaled, he'd never go up to the house. They'd come out in their kimonos, and you could see them, you know, just look right through them. Well, I'd pedal with Pa. Dad would just go to the foot. They'd come down, meet him. Of course, they wanted his fruit and stuff, his ice cream, because it was handy. And Dad would wait on them, and they acted respectfully. I didn't see anything wrong with them. Whatever they was doing was their business. And old Dr. Page had to go up there. I wonder what his wife thought. He had to go up there and check on them, you know, examine them, so that they weren't diseased or something. And, oh, you learn a whole lot as you grow up, I'll tell you.
Dr. Page, who was our neighbor, had no children, and I was very fond of him, and he was very fond of me because he took me on little trips when he went to visit people who were really sick. He and I were very good friends, as well as his wife, whom I called Pagey. My mother was always crazy about Dr. Page taking me with him because he didn't take my little brother with him, too, but my mother thought that wasn't fair. You know, little boys are little boys, but little girls are cute. And there's no difference except that people think about it that way. Years later, when Mrs. Page and Mrs. Smithclaw came to visit my family in Hollidaysburg, they were teasing Mrs. Page because when these girls came from this house of ill repute to see the doctor, as soon as they left, Mrs. Page would go around with a bucket of water and a towel and wipe off the doorknobs and anything that these girls may have touched.
And the girls, they came from Rochester. Yeah, and they were all beautifully well-dressed. They were beautiful girls. I'll tell you, they looked like queens. They lived downtown. Every Saturday, we kids would go stand by the stand ball where they had ice cream. And they always went in there and had their ice cream soda and then buy different things. And we'd stand there and admire those girls, how beautiful they were. And of course, we were kids. We didn't know what they were. We didn't know what it was all about.
And on June 15th, the young girls of Austin buzzed with gossip when they heard that Cora had been charged for keeping a hoot house, a pleasure palace. She was arrested by Constable Hoffmeister and Deputy Sheriff Babcock. On August 28th, there was an eerie uneasiness around Austin when word spread that a newly built concrete dam had broken near the Baylis Chemical Company of Kettner, as the crow flies about 30 miles southwest of Austin. Messengers running downstream forewarned people, and no one was killed, but the property damage was extensive. For optimists, the Kettner disaster offered a false sense of security. They felt that if the Austin Dam broke, they too could escape. But to doomsters, the Kettner disaster was an omen, a warning of what might happen. Owners of the mills of Austin moved much of their valuable lumber to higher ground.
It'd been raining for 2 days. The dam was full, nearly overflown. As I looked at it in the moonlight, the great white bank of concrete was ghostly. The cracks seemed to be dividing ever so slowly, and the water seemed to snake and slither through the walls. At that moment, it crossed my mind, what if Willie Nelson was right?
It was a sunny, pleasant Saturday as people milled around town. During the morning, a telephone lineman created a flurry of excitement when he accidentally set off 2 false fire alarms. A primary election was being held. Adam Broad, who lived in the first house below the dam, was downtown voting. The Potter County Commissioner's race was shaping up as a close one, and Broad favored Charlie Austin, the son of the town's founder. Mrs. Broad stayed home because only men were allowed to vote. Around noon, John Brownlee came up from Costello.
I went up to Austin to get some groceries at Nelson's store. When I got there, Willie was mad. Said he and Bob Pearson wanted Hamlin to let the water out of the dam. But Hamlin got angry and called them a bunch of big heads. He said they didn't know what they were talking about and shouldn't be stirring up trouble. Told Willie, people ought to be happy to have a job. Round about 1 o'clock, I headed back to Costello.
Near 2 o'clock, Ellen Benson and her daughter Ellen were seen going into Delberto's Dreamland Theater to watch the matinee showing of Beyond the Divide. At Brisbo's barbershop, several hicks were in for a shave. Some needed a special treatment for sore heads caused by the bites of pants rabbits. Mary Mansui and her daughter were getting ready to take a bath. Annie Dermick was rocking her infant child, and Mame Renix was putting her daughter Evelyn to bed for an afternoon nap. Reverend Gamble was busy working on his Sunday sermon. At the mill, Hicks were delivering pulpwood to add to the 5-year supply of wood stacked like mountains between the mill and the dam. Hicks feared that if the dam ever gave way, the countless stacks of pulpwood would be pushed together and create a moving dam of loose logs that would destroy everything in its path as it pushed downstream toward Austin. Just a stone's throw above the dam, Harry Davis and Cora Brooks were outside enjoying the sunny afternoon. Cora had been released on bail pending a trial. She told Harry she was worried about the dam being so full.
Dora! I'm up here on the hill, and I've seen it. You gotta put out the call. I've seen it. The dam is broken.
I rang as many phones as I could until I saw a mountain of debris coming down the valley. A grim, eerie mist was above it, and the roar was horrifying. It crushed and buried all that stood in its way. As I ran to the hillside, I could see houses, tossing like corks, bumping against one another, spinning and splintering into pieces. I was petrified when I saw the steeple of the Presbyterian Church crumble, then fall upon Senator Baldwin's home. I knew the senator's crippled father and his blind mother would never be able to survive.
I was downtown voting when people got word the dam broke. And they started yelling and running in a frenzy. For me, all I could think of was my daughter Adora and my wife Lena. So I ran up Turner Street looking for them. As I did, Adora came running down the street. So I headed her up the hill, and then I continued to race like crazy up Turner toward home, looking for Lena. But as I got about 50 yards from our house, I could see it being pushed from its foundation, so I had no choice. I had to hightail it up the hill, the waters rolling from behind me every step of the way. I'll always believe that Lena was looking for me while I was looking for her.
At first, I didn't pay much attention to the warning whistle, because there'd been 2 false alarms in the morning. Besides, like most people, I thought if the dam ever broke, the warning whistle was going to be one long blast. Instead, there were 8 short toots, and then the blast.
I was carrying little Anne Marie in my arms, but I just couldn't get over the barbed wire fence. My long dress kept getting entangled in it. Then an immigrant woman I'd never met appeared from nowhere, and she took little Anne Marie in her arms so I could get over. Then she lifted Anne Marie over the fence and gently handed her to me. But as she did, the raging waters rose, and they took the immigrant woman. The woman whose words I could not understand disappeared.
Olive McKinney was wading through water, ankle high, desperate to get her children up the hill, an infant in one arm, another tugging at her dress. Seeing her, Joe Damahusky rushed down to help, and somehow, some way, they saved the children. But seconds later, Joe and Olive became trapped in pulpwood.
The shoemaker, Rafael Donofrio, his wife Angelina, and their 5 children were hurrying along as best they could. Then one of the children, I think it was Antonio, stopped and fell behind the rest of the family. He was terror-stricken. He stood still, staring at the huge mass of wreckage coming down the valley. When the rest of the family realized he was not with them, his mother, father, brothers, and sisters, they all turned back and ran to get him.
Ed Irway was desperately clinging to the ridge of his house. He stretched out his arm, frantically trying to save his wife. Then he lost his grip.
I was working in the mill, and as I went to get out, a heavy pulp grinding stone broke through the wall, and my right leg got pinned under it. At first, a bunch of men tried to push it off, but they couldn't, and water started rushing into the room, and all of them ran, except for a big Polander. I screamed and I screamed. I pleaded for him to chop off my leg. I begged him. I said, I can stand it if you can stand it. At first, he just turned away, but then, without a word, he grabbed an axe.
The next thing I remember, he was carrying me to the North Penn Hospital.
It looked as if the dam had been clawed and ripped apart by a powerful and mysterious force, like an angry panther lashing out to protect its territory, a creature made vicious by the invasion of its domain.
En voyant l'ampleur du désastre, j'ai compris que la bête capitaliste avait été lâchée.
I'll never forget the cries of fear, animal cries a man makes when he and his loved ones face death, but may not be prepared for it. It is a miserable memory, one that lingers deep inside of me.
I wanted to scream, but I just couldn't. I was so scared and overwhelmed by the weeping that I became deaf, and I remained that way for nearly a month.
After the waters passed, fires, fed by broken gas lines, erupted everywhere. Few people stood back. They looked at the flames as a tragic blessing. They figured the fires might help stop the spread of diseases from stagnant waters, polluted by dead bodies. They said they were afraid because they remembered the Austin fevers, the terrible typhoid epidemic that went through Austin before there was a public water system. But most of us, despite our fears, joined the bucket brigades, and we went and fought the fires. We wanted our dead. We wanted to bury our people with the respect they deserved as human beings.
The odor of burning flesh, dead dogs, cats, horses, cows, and sometimes a human being often turns strong men into less than what they wanted to be.
People wandered through the wreckage, poking into pile after pile, calling out the names of their loved ones with no real hope they'd ever answer. I felt lost, drained, sapped of my strength, spiritless. What did it all mean? How could God let this happen? I had prayed that it had never happened. I wanted to run from what was before me. I knew my life could never be the same.
We struggled getting up the hill from Turner Street. My mother badly twisted her ankle and was exhausted with fear. So after the waters passed, I told her to stay up on the hillside while I went down to search for my father. I ripped off part of my dress and put it on the end of a stick. I told my mother I'd wave it twice if I found out my father was alive. 3 times if he was dead.
Beneath one of the piles of debris, searchers found a clock. It told the exact time the disaster struck Austin, 2:29. About 3 miles below Austin, near Costello, they found Mr. Earl, dead in the crotch of a tree. People said he had been safe on the hillside, but he ran back to cut loose his horses. All but one of them survived.
During the weeks after the disaster, broken bodies were brought to a makeshift morgue on Thorn Street. Some were so mangled that they could only be identified by a ring. Small children were wrapped in blankets with one of their tiny shoes put on top.
My father and my mother were found buried in the ruins just below Austin. As the men trudged along the tracks with my father's lifeless body, a nearby train whistled, and then it threw out a big plume of smoke. John Brownlee said it was like a special tribute to my father. When my brother Howard and I found that a lot of the stuff in our store was still usable, we decided to give it to the people who had lost everything in the flood. We knew that that would probably be what my parents would have done. Like a lot of the people, Howard and I thought Austin would just become a ghost town, that people would leave the town, and there would be nobody to remember, or there would be nobody to take care of the dead. So we had my parents put into a single-sealed casket. And then they were taken by train to Wellsville. And there they rest in peace, just across the Pennsylvania border, about 50 miles northeast of Austin.
Our church, St. Augustine's on Turner Street, was totally destroyed. The people's faith shaken and tested. A desperate situation. But as the hours passed, they turned to the undying love of God. They believed it was a miracle when they found an unbroken statue of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. They saw it as a message, a sign from God, to always remember that in the wisdom of divine providence, there is a time and a purpose for everything.
Ryle Prosser and Charlie Stump were the first to flash word of the disaster to the outside world. That evening, the New York Telegram reported that 500 had died. On Sunday morning, the San Francisco Examiner reported that 1,000 people had died when a bursting dam hurled a seething sea upon Austin. By Monday morning, the London Times told of the bursting of a dam in America. In its Tuesday edition, the Le Temps of Paris described the devastation and death of 2,000 people in a small town in the mountains of Pennsylvania. While the New York Times refused to recognize the role of Cora Brooks at all, the New York Evening Telegram coyly referred to her as Mrs. Harvey Davis. Meanwhile, the Philadelphia North American and other papers praised Cora Brooks as one of Austin's heroines. In the days that followed, offers to help came from throughout America. President Taft sent a telegram expressing sympathy from the entire nation.
I have been shocked and horrified by news of the catastrophe that has befallen your thriving village. I want to express to you my sympathy as an individual and as President of the United States. I am sure the entire nation joins me. Please wire me at Omaha as to the extent of the disaster and as to your needs.
John Kinley Tenner, an Irish immigrant who had risen to become the governor of Pennsylvania, arrived on the scene and vowed to take action against those responsible for the disaster. National concern about the children was overwhelming. Hundreds of letters poured in from all over the country with offers to adopt orphan children. During the week that followed the disaster, State Health Commissioner Sam Dixon directed the cleanup with the help of nearly 1,000 relief workers, most of whom were Italian immigrants. In the aftermath of most disasters, people pillage and steal what they can. But in Austin, there were only a few reports of theft, one of which involved a group of relief workers who said that they could no longer work in the stink of death without the help of alcohol, so they stole liquor from the Higgins liquor store. During the cleanup time, Bayless had a list prepared of all the men who helped. He let it be known that anyone who didn't would be blacklisted and never be given a job at the mill. He also hired agents to get flood victims to sign pledges not to sue the company. For his part, Bayless agreed to reopen the mill. 2 weeks after the disaster, the election ballot boxes were found near Costello. Though water-soaked, the ballots were counted. Charlie Austin, who otherwise would have lost the election, ended up winning the commissioner's race by just one vote. There were many sightseers who came to Austin to see the disaster firsthand, but most Americans learned about it through newsreels.
Down in the little valley, mid the Potter County hills, where stood the town of Austin, with its factories and its mills, on the 30th of September, and such a pretty day, Without a moment's warning, the concrete dam gave way. With mighty force the water rushed toward our little town. The mill was left a perfect wreck and part of it torn down. The houses fell like toothpicks, by the water they were tossed. $5 million gone, and 100 lives were lost. When I think of that disaster, it nearly chills my blood. For I thought my wife and little ones had perished in the flood. But thank God they hadn't reached the flat when the waters had passed by. It was the hand of Providence, it wasn't their day to die. Artists there can paint the picture of the horrors of that day. For many a heart was bleeding for their loved ones swept away. I stood that night and watched them before I went to bed, searching up and down the valley, trying to find their dead. Some of them had lanterns, but very many more were lighted by the buildings that were burning on the shore. The gas lines all were broken, and so were the water mains. But a bucket brigade soon organized to try and quench the flames. They fought with all their might and main, they held out to a man, until a company was dispatched from the town of Olean. Then soon were left in darkness. Oh, what a dreadful night. I never can describe it, nor e'er forget the sight. But morning came as usual. Oh, what a fearful sight to see those men and women who had wandered round all night. Their hearts were sad and heavy as they turned the wreckage o'er. They were looking for their loved ones that perchance had washed ashore. If you could have seen them, they were scattered here and there. Some were sobbing bitterly, some were knelt in prayer. Now all that's left of Austin is what's standing on the hills. It destroyed in 20 minutes what took 20 years to build.
During the investigation that followed, Bob Pearson claimed that he told Mr. Hamlin about the possibility of a break 4 hours before the dam actually broke. But instead of doing anything, Hamlin was annoyed and told him that one shouldn't cry until one was hurt. Another fella, Bill Brady, told investigators,
"We should have listened to Willie Nelson. He was a great guy and a good citizen. He had courage and lots of common sense."
Willie Nelson, oh, the man, oh yes, he had a grocery store. Every night he went up to the hospital, to the dam, to see what the dam looked like. He checked it. He did it every night until the night before. He never took his two horses up. He had, I don't know, something happened. He couldn't go or something. But anyway, he didn't go that night. He was quite a man, a very fine man.
Newspaper cartoonists provoked a national discussion about who was to be blamed for the disaster. There was never a public trial, and no one ever assumed or shared responsibility for the 78 people known to have died. The burden was too much for anyone to accept, so no one did.
It was a case of misfortune, not negligence. I was an entrepreneur taking reasonable risks, trying to make an honest profit. I created hundreds of jobs for the people of Austin. Given the facts as I was told, my decisions were sensible judgments. God knows I would not act as a fool. I truly believed it was a dam that could not break. I only ask for your understanding. If you were in my shoes, can you honestly say you would have done things differently?
If the dam had been built as I designed it, it never would have broken. But to save costs and for the sake of profit, Mr. Bayless gambled. He took chances. He chose to ignore the best judgments of engineering science. Some people say I should have expressed my private doubts about the dam. They say I was too willing to remain silent, too concerned with protecting the confidentiality of my professional relationship with Mr. Bayless. Maybe so. But remember, I was working for Mr. Bayless, not the people of Austin.
Sure, I allowed the dam to be filled. We had a long backlog of orders. It had been dry, and I had to be sure we had enough water. Sure, Willie Nelson said it was unsafe, but not Mr. Bayless or anybody with real authority. I figured if the dam ever broke, the water would spread out before it reached Austin, and I thought the log dam would hold, but it broke too. I made the best decision I could in a tough situation, and now I must live with it.
I defended property rights. I believed that government should not interfere in the affairs of a private business. I objected to having state inspections of the dam. I did not want anything done that might cause Bayless to move his company, move to a state more friendly to free enterprise with fewer government bureaucrats and less red tape. Now, I feel the sorrow, the tragedy of losing my parents and my sister, Grace, who tried so hard in vain to save them. Experience has taught me one cannot defend property rights at the expense of human rights.
In the aftermath of the Johnstown flood, President Grover Cleveland urged our state to enact regulations to assure the safety of man-made dams, and I agreed with him. But instead of working in the public interest, legislators played a game of endless political debate, and in the process, they neglected to do what needed to be done. 2 tragedies are enough. It is time for the Commonwealth to act.
Some people feel it is very important to figure out why the disaster occurred and who is responsible for it. But for me, it is far more important to recognize and remember how the people of Austin dealt with their fate.
In the aftermath of the disaster, George Helwig, a man who had lost his wife, daughter, and granddaughter, led a delegation to Congress to make a special appeal for federal assistance, but the appeal was denied. The Congressional Committee decided that disaster relief was a state and local responsibility. At the state level, assistance was granted to bondholders, but nothing was given to the victims and their families. Critics charged the state with pitying the rich while leaving the poor to beg. In the meantime, George Helwig faced a surprise. He learned that his wife, Hattie, left him only $50 out of a $20,000 estate. The couple had been separated for 10 years, and during that time, Hattie had become a very successful Austin businesswoman. George claimed that the two had reconciled a week before the disaster, but Hattie had never changed her will.
In December of 1911, Cora Brooks was brought to trial for running a house of prostitution. In her defense, the town's survivors petitioned the court for leniency. They cited Cora's role in saving the people of Austin. Convinced, Judge Omerod gave Cora a very light fine.
Cora Brooks, you have been ill-famous for many years. You have pled guilty to keeping a bawdy house and selling liquor without a license. But at the time of the Austin disaster, you demonstrated that you are not totally depraved, that indeed you are humane as well as human. I hereby fine you $200 plus costs. All other sentences are suspended.
She was a heroine because she lived above the dam and she was able to help the people that were homeless. And in an emergency, she was a good woman.
We didn't disregard them. They weren't doing anything but living their lives. Maybe they made a couple dollars, and well, that went quite a ways, you know, way back. But money was worth something then. So we just, everybody respected everybody regardless of what they were into and what they were up to.
I do remember that she was considered, that there was a woman like that who was considered very wonderful because of what she did, and who had not, I got the idea, who had not previously been considered a wonderful woman. Saved lives and changed people's ideas of what kind of woman she was, which I think was wonderful.
I'm very proud of my grandmother. No matter what she did, she turned out to be a really good woman. As kids, we didn't have too much, you know, but I've always been proud of what we become. I mean, I have this attitude: life is what you make it, not what somebody makes it for you.
In April of 1912, less than a year after the Austin disaster, the Titanic sunk. And like the Austin disaster, it too cast public doubt about the pride of human decision-making and on the engineering feats of science. In 1920, the Bayliss Company constructed a community building on the site of E.O. Austin's homestead. With the passage of time, the people of Austin not only forgave Bayliss, but honored him as one of their Citizens of the Year. In 1932, a very popular Judy Bolton mystery story entitled The Vanishing Shadow was read by millions of young girls. It was based upon the disaster at Austin. The author, Margaret Sutton, lived a few miles above the dam.
My home wasn't washed away, and in the story, Judy lost her home, but she went to live with her grandparents in Odin, and Odin is really where I live. I knew the dam was supposed to be not solid, but I didn't believe it. It looked solid to me. Well, it looked like a lake. It went from one hill to the other. It was beautiful to look at, and I didn't believe it was dangerous. That's in the book. I had Judy not believe it, but her brother did. So that was why I had him be the hero, rather than Judy, because she didn't believe it would break.
In 1942, a flash flood caused the New Bayless Dam to break, and again, waters rushed into Austin to cause massive destruction. Then about a year later, a hellish fire consumed the remains of the Bayless Mill. Today, travelers passing through Austin usually stop to gaze in disbelief at the empty dam of unfulfilled dreams. It's a tranquil place to reflect upon the risky decisions of life and the way humans deal with their fate. Though the panther is seldom seen, natives believe that he still roams around Big Lookout. Indeed, his spirit is expressed in the poems of the people.
Cracked, ruined dam above our town, symbol of hope which came tumbling down. Crusher of dreams not meant to be, now you stand so quietly. A reminder of what stood before. Broken dam, you're a threat no more. You are still here, but so are we, unbroken.